All right, good morning, everybody. I appreciate everyone coming out on a very pretty and spring-forward morning. I know it's tough to get out of bed on the Sunday of spring forward. Before we begin, just an announcement, a reminder that the worship changes that begin April 7th. 8:30 there'll be a traditional worship in the Memorial Chapel here as opposed to the sanctuary. And then the traditional worship will be at Temple Emmanuel at 9:30. And I don't know why I'm holding this up like y'all can see that. It's a visual aid of some sort. It is a teacher thing. 9:30 traditional service at Temple Emmanuel, then 10:45 a traditional worship at Temple Emmanuel, and Rejoice will be in the usual spot in the Mullen Life Center. And then March 17th, there's an open house at Temple Emmanuel just to look around and kind of get your bearings. And that will be from 9:30 to noon. Again, that's on March the 17th. So, as I said in the email that I sent out for this weekend, I got a little ahead of myself, and there's a lot of material that I have right here. So, whether we can get this knocked out prior to 10:30, well, we'll see. We're going to do our best. So, I might in the end be kind of frantically scurrying to try to make it to the end. And one way or the other, though, let's keep going. I want to start this morning by telling an Eastern parable because I think that it serves as a nice entry point to the ideas that I want to discuss. There's this merchant, and he was a widower, and he went away on a business trip, and he left his little boy at home alone. And while the merchant was away, some bandits came, and they burned down the whole village. So when the merchant came home, he returned and he didn't find his house standing there. He just found a heap of ash. And close by, there was the charred body of a child. And so he immediately took that for his son. He threw himself on the ground and he cried and he cried and he beat his chest and he pulled his hair. And the next day, he had that little body, what was left of that, cremated. And because his son was his only reason for existence, he sewed this beautiful velvet bag and he put the ashes inside. And wherever he went, he took that bag of ashes with him. And so eating and sleeping and working, he always had that velvet bag of the ashes with him. The truth was, though, that his son had only been kidnapped by the bandits. And 3 months later, the boy escaped the bandits and he returned home. And when he arrived, it was 2 o'clock in the morning. And he knocked on the door of the new house that his father had built. And the father was lying on his bed, crying, holding the bag of ashes, and he called out, "Who's there?" The boy said, "It's me, Daddy, it's your son." The father goes and he opens the door and he looks at the son. He says, "That's not possible." He says, "My son's dead. I've cremated his body and I carry his ashes with me. You must be some naughty boy who's trying to fool me. Go away and don't disturb me." He slams the door in the boy's face. The boy had to go away, and the father lost his son forever. Welcome to class. I'm glad I can start on such an uplifting and happy note. You're welcome. Good morning. Now we're going to come back to this feel-good parable here in a minute, and we're going to attempt to unpack its meaning, and we're going to situate it within our own Christian context. But first, I want to begin by playing a band by the Goo Goo Dolls. I don't know if y'all are familiar with this band. Really, really popular band in the 90s. And this song, much like this parable, I think, serves as another good counterintuitive entry point to what we're going to talk about this morning. This is a song called Name.
Turn away. 'Cause all the dreams you never thought you'd lose, tossed along the way. Letters that you never meant and I won't tell him your name. Scars are souvenirs you never lose. The past was never far. Did you lose yourself somewhere out there? Did you get to be a star? Don't it make you sad to know that life is more than who we are? You grew up way too fast, now there's nothing to believe. The reruns all become our history. A tired song keeps playing on a tired radio, and I won't tell no one your name. And I won't tell them your name. I won't tell them your name.
All right, we're going to stop there in the interest of time. And I noticed a lot of y'all like that song as well, because I saw a lot of lips mumbling the lyrics. Let's look at these lyrics specifically, okay? And even though the moment passed me by, I still can't turn away. Because all the dreams you never thought you'd lose got tossed along the way. And now we're grown-up orphans and never knew their names. We don't belong to no one, that's a shame. We grew up way too fast, and now there's nothing to believe. And reruns all become our history. A tired song keeps playing on a tired radio, and I won't tell no one your name. Now let me start by saying I love this song. This is one of my favorite songs. Let me also say I have no clue what this song is about. First of all, the singer, Johnny Resnick, my man is all over the place with his pronouns in this song. We begin in the first person me, and we're talking to the second person you, and then suddenly we seem to be using the indefinite third person you, and then just as suddenly we become the first person plural we, and then immediately we shift to the indefinite third person plural there, and we're all over the place with our pronouns here is what I'm getting at. But I don't think that this erratic shifting of pronouns is a matter of Resnick not knowing how to use his pronouns. I really don't. I can't be sure of this, of course, I don't know the guy. But it seems to me that it's intentional. That the obscurity of the narrator and the obscurity of the audience he's addressing is an integral part of the design of the song itself. It makes the overt message obscure, arcane, hard to find. It makes the song something that we have to wrestle with and grapple with to try to make meaning out of. I mean, it could just be me. Maybe I'm completely wrong about that. But one way or the other, I know I have no clue what the song's about. And I've been listening to this song for over 20 years. No idea what the specific message of this song is. I'm convinced, though, that by taking the lyrics at their literal face value, there's no universal takeaway that we can find that is beyond a shadow of a doubt what Johnny Resnick was saying in that song. We're not given enough information there in that text. I've heard before that the song is about Resnick's parents both passing away when he was young, and how his sister, who was also young, was left to raise him, and how this song was in effect a song of appreciation to her. I've also heard that it's about how Resnick, when he was young, he befriended a girl who was a foster child, a girl who'd had a really hard life, and she'd run away from the state where she was still having to be as an underage orphan, and that she had these dreams of being an actress, and that years later, after she had disappeared from his life, he remembered her and he wrote this song about her. This, if you look at the lyrics of the song, it seems to fit very well, and if that's a true story, then it's a very lovely sentiment. But all this to say, there's nothing in the song that, unless we're given extra outside information, would enable us to be able to take that away from the story. So this morning, I want us to look through the song, or look at the song through a lens that's admittedly probably far from what Johnny Resnick, the artist, was thinking when he wrote it. We're going to probably find in this some meaning that he didn't intend, but I believe that this is something that is true of all art. That once the artist publishes his or her art, he or she really has no control over how that's going to be interpreted by us. This is somewhat of a postmodern idea, and people would argue with that. But I mention that term postmodernism because later we're going to use another postmodern idea to kind of get another angle of looking at what I want to address this morning. And I will also say that I, at root, disagree with the postmodern position that there's no such thing as a universal absolute truth and that everything is this social construction. I don't think that's the case at all, but I think there are valuable insights we can glean from some of the ideas that postmodern philosophy has put forward in the last 30, 40 years. Now, all that said, let's look at Matthew 13. We're going to pray and we'll get going. The same day Jesus went out of the house and sat by the lake. Such large crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat in it, while all the people stood on the shore. Then he told them many things in parables, saying, A farmer went out to sow his seed. As he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Some fell on rocky places where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow. But when the sun came up, the plants were scorched, and they withered because they had no root. Other seed fell among thorns, which grew up and choked the plants. Still other seed fell on good soil where it produced a crop, 100, 60, or 30 times what was sown. Whoever has ears, let them hear. The disciples then came to him and asked, Why do you speak to the people in parables? He replied, Because the knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of heaven has been given to you, but not to them. Whoever has will be given more, and they will have an abundance. Whoever does not have, even what they have will be taken from them. This is why I speak to them in parables. Though seeing, they do not see. Though hearing, they do not understand. In them is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah. You will be ever hearing, but never understanding. You will be ever seeing, but never perceiving. For this people's heart has become calloused. They hardly hear with their ears, and they have closed their eyes. Otherwise they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and turn, and I would heal them. But blessed are your eyes because they see, and your ears because they hear. For truly I tell you, many prophets and righteous people longed to see what you see, but did not see it, and to hear what you hear, but did not hear it. Let's pray and get going. God, we thank you for another morning, another opportunity to come together as friends and think about and talk about and wrestle with what it means to know you and to be in a relationship with you and to be loved by you. Pray that you would deepen our understanding of all those things this morning through your Holy Spirit. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. I recently, with our book club here at the church, reread Harper Lee's classic book, To Kill a Mockingbird. And that was a couple months ago. And ever since then, I've been reflecting on one of the book's most prominent themes, and that's the biblical precept that in order to inherit the kingdom of God, we must become like small children. We hear this maxim quite a bit, right? This idea that to inherit the kingdom of God, we need to become small children. There's some type of a greater truth in being able to revert to our childish ways. But I've been thinking about that maxim a lot lately, and I've been really trying to think about what that really means under its surface level. To understand things, it can be very opposite to look first at that thing's opposite. Think about what something is not. And the opposite of small children I've been thinking about, and I've come up with a couple things that would be the opposite of small children and be applicable to grown adults. Grown adults, for one thing, I've realized are sophisticated. We're sophisticated. And here I'm using the word sophisticated in its most original sense. I'm taking it from the root sophist, which refers to a category of teachers in ancient Greece who, in a nutshell, these were teachers who were accused of teaching their students how to be deceptive and how to be calculating in order to achieve their desired ends. So by that nature, we're very sophisticated. We know how to manipulate something to achieve whatever our desired end is. It's just something that comes with growth and maturity. The second thing that grown adults are is we're independent. At least we like to think we are. As adults, we feel we no longer need guides, that we can figure things out for ourselves. And finally, as grown adults, we become very set in our ways. We have a way that we like to do things. We believe we've found the system that works for us, and we're not interested in learning anything that challenges our status quo understanding of how that thing works. It's just natural. It's the way that we are as adults. So looking at the idea from this angle, I then realized that on the contrary, small children, they are dependent. They know beyond a doubt that they have to have help from someone greater than them. They know this. Meanwhile, unlike grown adults, small children, they know that they can't learn unless they ask questions. It's just something that they intuitively know. That's why they're constantly asking questions. Finally, as such, small children, they have an unquenchable curiosity. You ever notice that about kids? They just have this unquenchable desire to know things. It's this unspoiled desire to learn and grow and be challenged. In C.S. Lewis's book, The Magician's Nephew, the third in his series of Narnia books, one of his characters says, "What you see and hear depends a good deal on where you're standing. It also depends on what sort of person you are." I think this is a great insight. What you see and hear depends a good deal on where you're standing. It depends also on what sort of a person you are. This is an important insight because it reveals how we interpret meaning through our own unique lens, our own way of viewing the world. This is true on a macro level, meaning one's overarching worldview, but it's also true on a micro level. In other words, on how one is feeling in any given moment. The way that shades the way that we interpret anything that's presented to us. And it's these given moments, these micro level moments, that I want to speak to for a brief second, because slowly, quietly, these micro moments give shape to our macro beliefs if we're not paying attention. One small decision, we've talked about this several times here, one small decision leads to another, to where suddenly it's affected our way of looking at the entire world. And I know I've read it in here countless times, but I do so for a reason, because I think that this is one of the most important spiritual lessons that we can absorb, but I also think it's one of the simplest lessons in the busyness of our everyday lives to overlook. So again, once more, I'm going to reread this small passage from C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. Every time you make a choice, you are turning the central part of you, the part that chooses, into something a little different than it was before. And taking your life as a whole, with all your innumerable choices, all your life long, you're slowly turning this central thing into a heavenly creature or into a hellish creature. Either into a creature that is in harmony with God, and with other creatures, and with itself, or else into one that is in a state of war and hatred with God, and with its fellow creatures, and with itself. To be the one kind of creature is heaven. That is, it is joy and peace and knowledge and power. To be the other means madness, horror, idiocy, rage, impotence, and eternal loneliness. Each of us, at each moment, is progressing to the one state or the other. So to put a point on it, the mundane moments in our lives shape how we view the natural. And over time, this inevitably shapes how we view the supernatural. It just does. Because it affects our filter for perceiving and understanding things. In other words, as adults, it's very easy for us to miss the forest for the trees. And again, as Lewis says, what you see and hear depends a good deal on where you're standing. It also depends on what sort of person you are. Or the way Jesus puts it, whoever has ears to hear, let him hear. I bring all this up to speak about parables. Parables were the chief way that Christ communicated his message to his disciples. In fact, in Matthew 13:34, it says, he did not say anything to them without using a parable. Now, this is obviously a hyperbole. He had to have spoken some things to them that were not, in fact, in parables. But the point remains. He used parables to try to convey his messages. And so we have to ask why he would do that. Why would he rely so heavily on this rhetorical device of parable to communicate his message? And if we look back at Matthew 13, at the passage that we read, we see we're not the only ones who asked this. In verse 10, here it is again. It says, quote, the disciples came to him and asked, why do you speak to the people in parables? This question that the disciples asked is interesting for several reasons, not least of which is the fact that the disciples didn't ask, what does this mean? But rather they asked, why do you speak this way? Meaning, of course, in parables. Why do you speak this way in parables? To which Jesus replied, his reply to that question was that in his parables they are, quote, being given the knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of heaven. That was his answer to that question. Not a very direct answer, right? The implication here is that if the goal is in fact an interactive relationship with God, which at its core is what being in the kingdom of God means. It means being in relationship, constant relationship with God. It means that if this is the case, then parables succeed where easy and obvious explanations don't succeed. In other words, with a clear and easy explanation, hearers can listen, immediately achieve understanding, and walk away completely independent of the teacher. You're given information, you no longer rely on the teacher, you walk off, and you have that piece of information. However, when a parable or a teaching confounds them, it then invites them to continue asking questions, to continue wrestling, to continue depending on that teacher to grow them further and further in their understanding. Thus, when we're confounded, we have two choices. We can walk away in anger and an impatient arrogance, in effect saying, this is a complete waste of my time. Or we can respond with eagerness and with curious humility, saying, I can't let this go. I have to know more. And that keeps you coming back for deeper and deeper insight. So in this way, parables don't inform their hearer. They transform the hearer. And I'm getting all of this that I'm saying right here from a writer, Brian McLaurin, who the way he punctuates this is by saying that perhaps Jesus spoke in parables because he wasn't merely trying to convey information. Instead, perhaps he was seeking to precipitate the spiritual transformation of his hearers. He goes on to say, the form of a parable helps to shape a heart that is willing to enter an ongoing, interactive, persistent relationship of trust in the teacher. It beckons the hearer to explore new territory. It helps form a heart that is humble enough to admit it doesn't already understand, and is thirsty enough to ask questions. In other words, a parable renders its hearer not as experts, not as know-it-alls, not as scholars, but as children. When Matthew 13 references the Old Testament book of Isaiah, it suggests that people don't, quote, have ears to hear because their hearts have become calloused, but that children in their innocence and purity do have ears to hear. This, of course, ties back to Lewis's teaching on how we day by day make decisions leading either to joy or hard-heartedness. If we make decisions that lead us to where we're angry and envious and bitter and jealous, of course that affects how open we are to grappling with and understanding and trying to grow in things. It affects the way that we view anything presented to us. Brian McLaurin goes on to finish, but if it is the heart that matters, then hearts can't be coerced. Nobody can be forced. They can be invited, attracted, intrigued, enticed, and challenged, but not forced. And that perhaps is the greatest genius of a parable. It doesn't grab you by the lapels and scream in your face, repent, you vile sinner, turn or burn. Rather, it works gently, subtly, and directly. It doesn't batter you into submission, but leaves you free to discover and to choose for yourself. Now, I'll return to this thought in just a second, but I quickly want to shift tracks to look at this from a slightly different angle. Several years ago, I got a speeding ticket. About several years ago, but I'm speaking about one instance. The lawyer's office that I worked with to help me out with this speeding ticket happened to be right next door to the house I grew up in as a child. The parking lot, by that I mean the driveway backed up to the backyard that I grew up in as a child. And so standing there, I was forced. I didn't have any choice. I mean, obviously I was happy to do it, but I couldn't have not looked on my backyard as a child. And as I did, I was blown away by how different it was from how I remembered it. The details were the same. It looked the same, but what was different were the proportions. It was tiny. It was tiny. But as a kid, it was gigantic. That backyard, that gigantic backyard of my memory, that's where I learned to kick a soccer ball, where I learned to throw and to catch. And I realized while standing there that I had 100% probably more memories of that yard. And that every one of those memories, every one of them, was insufficient to describe the reality of the experience that I'd had. Because every one of those memories failed to grasp the scale of the environment. In other words, whereas my memory perceived those dimensions as being huge, really, the dimensions were very, very small. So I understood part of that memory, but I didn't have the whole thing right. My proportions were way off. I likewise had a very similar experience not long ago. I had occasion to visit my old elementary school. Same exact thing happened. And these experiences, of course, this is nothing particular to me. I'm sure probably everyone in this room has had a similar experience. And when they happen, we all readily grasp what the principle at work is. We realize right away that as we grow, our perspective on things changes. We take that away right away. It doesn't take a genius to figure out what's going on there. We realize that the more we wrap our head around the things from our youth, the smaller we realize they really were. This is a common experience. This can also, though, work in reverse. And this moment when it works in reverse, that's really what I want to talk about this morning. The second book of the Narnia series, the one that precedes The Magician's Nephew, which we just talked about, Lucy, who was in many ways the hero of the first book, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the one whom Lewis drew to represent childlike faith because she was the youngest and the most credulous. She was the quickest to believe the truths that the older, more sophisticated kids wouldn't believe. She, who in the first book, because of her simple faith, was the closest to Aslan, and if you're not familiar with the Narnia books, Aslan represents Jesus. So it's not accidental that Lewis has the smallest child be the one who has the most intimate, pure relationship with Aslan. Here in book 2, it's also not an accident that it is to Lucy that Aslan first reveals himself. They've been in Narnia again for a while, and Aslan first reveals himself to Lucy. And when he does, the short exchange between Lucy and Aslan, it's incredibly profound. Here's what it says. Aslan says, "Welcome, child." Aslan said, "Lucy, you're bigger." "That is because you're older, little one," he answered. "Not because you are?" she asked. "I'm not," he answered. "But every year you grow, you will find me bigger." Every year you grow, he said, you will find me bigger. This is such a profound truth. The more we grow in our relationship with God, the bigger we will continue to find him to be. Several years ago, one of my heroes, a guy I consider to be a mentor, he told me that he was with his mentor, his spiritual mentor, and in conversation, my mentor's mentor asked him, there's a lot of mentors in one sentence, he asked him, "How much of the gospel would you say that you understand?" To which my friend said that in his head he was thinking, "Well, God, I've got to have at least 90% of it figured out, but I can't very well say this to this guy. I got to come off humble." So he said that he kind of stumbled around and said, I'd say that I have a pretty good amount of it figured out. To which his mentor, this man that he profoundly respects, this person that he affectionately refers to as his spiritual Jedi mind master. He says that this Jedi mind master of a guy looks to him inside and says, I honestly think I only understand about 5%. Which apparently floored my friend. Because here was this man whose spiritual insight and years of scholarship and exemplary life that my friend so respected so profoundly. And here he was saying that after all of that time studying, and searching and growing, that he understood less than 5% of the gospel. And what he touched on here, I think, is a very beautiful truth. It's perhaps the most beautiful truth in the whole Christian story. And that's that the more that we grow in our relationship with God, the bigger we find God to be. And meanwhile, the smaller we find ourselves to be. The late 19th century psychologist Stanley Hall, who was one of the pioneers of the psychology of religion, he argued that our capacity for religious understanding coincides with our natural human developmental stages. And as such, childhood then is a time for gifted storytellers to simply stimulate the child's imagination. From here, Hall goes on to suggest that with each stage of development, a child is able to increasingly digest more and more complex concepts about God. and that this then holds true for when that child is an adolescent, and it continues to hold true for when we become adults. And the reason I mention any of this is to point out that each one of these steps is vital. That we can't, as 5-year-olds, understand anything more than a two-dimensional God. But that this two-dimensional God is every bit as awe-inspiring to the 5-year-old as a vivid Technicolor God is to a 45-year-old. Each step of our development is equally important to the ones that preceded it. However, to be able to speak of a next step, to be able to speak of a preceding step, that implies that we have to keep developing. And this, I'm afraid, isn't always the case, right? Going back to our early discussion, as grown adults, we're prone to think we already understand things, that we've pretty well got it figured out, that we don't need to go any further in our understanding. As adults, when we think we understand something, when we think we've grasped something, when we've appreciated it for the very fact that it in some way inspired us, moved us, shaped us, whatever, we cling to that thing as a found, understood, explicable thing. We've wrapped our minds around it, and that's what it is. And this most certainly applies to our understanding of God. C.S. Lewis gets at this idea really nicely in his book, The Weight of Glory. He says, "The books are the music in which we thought the beauty was located will betray us if we trusted them. It was not in them, it only came through them. And what came through them was longing. These things, the beauty, the memory of our own past, these are all good images of what we really desire. But if they are mistaken for the thing itself, they turn into dumb idols, breaking the hearts of their worshippers. For they are not the thing itself. They are only the scent of a flower we have not found, the echo of a tune we have not heard, news from a country we have never yet visited." This can be applied, this idea that he gets at, and I'd love to go into how Lewis riffs on this idea because he's so good at it, but we definitely are under time constraints right now. This can happen with art so easily, with music, with film. It really happens to me with music. Just a brief example. I was driving in my car this year, and the song by the band Live, Lightning Crashes, came on the radio. And suddenly, I was whisked away to this moment when I was in 8th grade, and I was at the beach with my friend Carson, and we were walking to deliver a letter at the post office. This was long before email. And I remembered in that moment the conversation we had. I could smell the beach. I could feel it. Now, I'm not just saying that it inspired a memory. That happens a lot because it had somehow taken me there. There was something transcendent that had happened about that. But as soon as I realized it, I snapped out of it. And I tried to get back in. But I couldn't get back into that moment the way I was in. I could remember it all, but I wasn't in that moment. I didn't still have that little taste. And C.S. Lewis talks about this thing as joy. Okay? In the song "The House That Built Me" by Miranda Lambert, a country song, we see her returning to the house of her childhood. And she sings, "I thought if I could touch this place or feel it, this brokenness inside me might start healing." Here, Lambert's character has made an image of her house to represent her childhood. And she hopes that in going back, it's going to somehow repair this void inside of her. But the inevitable outcome of her returning to that house is that she's going to be let down. It's inevitable. Because seeing the house is only going to drive home the truth that the house was merely a physical symbol, a metaphor, a snapshot of how she once understood something, and how that understanding is now insufficient. Everything she understood about it was real, but she only understood it in part. She, like us, saw through a mirror darkly. She has to grow. She has to expand, has to dig deeper. Most importantly, we see from the Lucy story that this same principle can even be applied to our understanding of God. Because once we try to box God in, we have in that moment made an idol of him. An idol fashioned after our own image. So in other words, the thing that we grasp about God today, the growth we make in our understanding about God today, that becomes our idol tomorrow if we stop pursuing the mystery any further, if we take that as the totality of who God is. In my opinion, the postmodern French philosopher Jean Baudrillard gets at this idea really nicely, and even though he denies the existence of God, but even so, I think he gives us something interesting to think about for this discussion. He famously defended this idea of hyperreality. And hyperreality is this notion that claims there are 4 stages of reality, and they culminate in what's called hyperreality, which the argument is isn't even reality at all. In essence, it says there are these 4 phases of reality. The first phase reflects the reality. The second phase distorts the reality. The third phase, and this is where it gets really tricky, it masks the absence of the reality. And finally, the fourth phase is where the hyperreality becomes more real than the reality. Now, this is all a bit complicated, and again, we're under time constraints. So I think the best example of this idea in practice is given to us in an essay by the pop culture writer Chuck Klosterman. I don't know if y'all are familiar with Chuck Klosterman. He's a really interesting thinker. And in a book of essays that he published about 10 years ago, he had this really, really neat idea he put forward, that he says that he believes that anyone born approximately between 1968 and 1980 has a crush on John Cusack. He says, however, they only think they have a crush on John Cusack. They don't really have a crush on John Cusack. Instead, he says, they have a crush on Lloyd Dobler, his character from the movie Say Anything. He argues that everyone realizes that in every other role John Cusack plays, he's only playing a character. But they're convinced that when the camera stops rolling, he goes back to his real life, which is being Lloyd Dobler. And I think it's the same way 10, 15 years later for people with the actor Ryan Gosling. I think everyone really assumes he's the Noah Calhoun character from The Notebook, that he's acting in every other movie, but when he's done, he goes back to being Noah Calhoun. So the point that's being made here is that we create an image of what we think something is, what we want it to be, and then we project that image onto the thing. And suddenly, our fake image, the one that doesn't really exist, or if it does exist, the one that exists in a very limited and distorted fashion, that projected, distorted image becomes our reality. And to the greater point, I think it's so easy for us to do this with God, for us to remain stuck in our status quo understanding of who God is, all the while content believing that our own limited image of Him is the totality of His reality. Content just believing that that God that we've created to be able to understand, that completely encapsulates who God is. I referenced a line from 1 Corinthians 2 just a minute ago, and I want to quickly read verses 7 through 13. They say, "No, we declare God's wisdom a mystery that has been hidden, and that God destined for our glory before time began. None of the rulers of this age understood it, for if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. However, as it is written, what no eye has seen, what no ear has heard, and what no human mind has conceived, these things God has prepared for those who love Him. These are the things God has revealed to us by His Spirit. The Spirit searches all things, even the deep things of God. For who knows a person's thought except their own spirit within them? In the same way, no one knows the thoughts of God except the Spirit of God. What we have received is not the spirit of the world, but the Spirit who is from God, so that we may understand what God has freely given us. This is what we speak, not in words taught us by human wisdom, but in words taught by the Spirit, explaining spiritual realities with Spirit-taught words." It is the Spirit, this passage tells us, that leads us into truth. It's the Spirit, it tells us, that beckons us then to deeper truth. It suggests that we can never grow complacent with our current place, because this suggests complacency in our understanding of who God is, which suggests more than anything that we really don't know God at all. Now, with all this in mind, I want to tie that back into the Goo Goo Dolls song, and I want to revisit those lyrics through this particular context. It says, "Even though the moment passed me by, I still can't turn away, because all the dreams you never thought you'd lose got tossed along the way. To me, this speaks of the way we as children, how we eagerly cotton to an image of God. And how that first two-dimensional image of God is one of awe, of wonder, of love, of beauty. I think it speaks of how even after we've grown up, we cling to that God of our childhood, that once real, but now in some way imaginary God, because that God was simple. And amid a life that has robbed us of our innocence, we want to believe in that God, because we associate that God with a happier, simpler time. It says, and now we're grown-up orphans and never knew their names. We don't belong to no one, that's a shame. Here I take this to speak of how, content with our status quo understanding of our relationship with God, we reach a place in our lives where life's difficulties, life's pains, life's frustrations, how these leave us feeling acutely aware that our spiritual fortitude is somehow wildly insufficient. That the complexities of life demand in us a richer spiritual maturity, but like grown-up orphans, we feel alone and we feel directionless, all the while we're clinging to our simple understanding of God, our projected image of who God is, all the while unaware that every step of growth that we're willing to make in our relationship with God, every one of those steps will correspond to yet another level of spiritual maturity that will see us through life's complexities. But like the grown-up orphans, we cling back to that original image because we feel like we don't have the direction. We grew up way too fast and now there's nothing to believe. And reruns all become a history. And this picks up on this idea, speaking to the way we, instead of grappling with and wrestling with and growing in God, speaks to how we look back at our romanticized, simple image of God, and deeming that image to be insufficient for all of the things that we're facing in our adult lives, in our adult situations. How we place that God in a box. How we make that image of Him just a thing that we talk about at church. But all the while, though not verbalizing it to ourselves, we sense that our understood, boxed-in God, we sense that this God that we can get our head around is somehow not big enough to help us really face the realities of life. We'll pay lip service to it. But that boxed-in image of God we somehow think isn't big enough to really be able to help fortify us, give us that spiritual fortitude that we need for these complexities. And so in other words, our reruns all become a history. We go through the same motions we've gone through our whole lives. We go to church, maybe go to Bible study, pray now and again, but all the while it's like a rerun, something we've seen before. All the while, unbeknownst, we're praying to and believing in a God that we, in our own unique way, because we each individually have a way of doing it, we've all kind of created this idea that we've limited, unaware that we've trivialized and simplified it into something far lesser than the reality of who and what God really is. But you could hide beside me maybe for a while, and I won't tell no one your name. Finally, to me, these lyrics speak of the moment when we recognize the insufficiency of the status quo, of staying grounded and rooted in right where we are, of the moment we become willing to grow beyond our sophisticated adult answers about who God is, and when we confess that whatever we know about God, we only know in part, that it is only a fraction of His totality. And I won't tell them your name. In other words, I won't claim that this limited description right here, I won't claim any longer that this is who and all you are. That my understanding of you is wildly insufficient. I won't speak about you as if you are a boxed-in creature. Instead, I will appreciate you for the ineffable, inexpressible being that you really are. In The Weight of Glory, C.S. Lewis says, at present, we are on the outside of the world, the wrong side of the door. We discern the freshness and purity of the morning, but they do not make us fresh and pure. We cannot mingle with the splendors we see. But all the leaves of the New Testament are rustling with the rumor that it will not always be so. Someday, God willing, we will get in. Or as 1 Corinthians says, for now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then I shall know, even as I also am known. So to go back to that original parable, that really encouraging, uplifting parable that I told in the beginning, the one about the father and his son, what it's getting at is how often we're not able to see the truth because we've already made our minds up about what the truth is. Even when a new truth is staring us right in the face, we're not willing to accept that new truth because we have made up our minds. We have dug our heels in. We have claimed that we are fine with the status quo. We understand. Or we've chosen to see the message through one particular lens, and thus we've not considered all the other layers of meaning that might also be included. Or we've seen through a lens of anger, of arrogance, of hard-heartedness, and we haven't wrestled really, even though we think we haven't wrestled really with the question at all. One last point. Jesus responds to his disciples' question of why do you speak in parables by ultimately saying, but blessed are your eyes because they see, and your ears because they hear. For truly I tell you, many prophets and righteous people long to see what you see, but did not see it, and to hear what you hear, but did not hear it. Now, lest we overlook this, because it's so easy to overlook in the text, the disciples, they didn't see it. They didn't hear it. That's why they asked the question. They didn't understand. But here Jesus is saying, blessed are you because you heard and because you saw, which we take to imply because you understand. But no, they didn't understand. That's why they asked the question. Thus, we see that they're being praised not for their immediate understanding, but for their willingness to grapple with and ask the questions. Not for their smarts in being able to solve the riddle, for their willingness to, like a child, ask, why do you do this? What does it mean? And they keep wanting to grow. The ancient Israelites refused to say the name of God because they felt it was too sacred. That it was insufficient. That the name of God was insufficient for describing the totality of who God is. And in my opinion, I think they were on to something. Perhaps we'd be well suited to remember that whatever we think we comprehend about God, that we see that thing through a mirror darkly. That for now, like 1 Corinthians says, we only know in part. That like C.S. Lewis says, at present we're on the outside of the world, the wrong side of the door. And that perhaps we'd be well advised to approach our relationship with God the way the ancient Israelites did, in effect saying, like the Goo Goo Dolls, and I won't tell them your name. And that's all I have this morning. I appreciate y'all coming out. Okay,